Good morning. It's good to see you. We're going to be in Luke chapter 9 just for a few minutes this morning. Luke chapter 9. Brother Bailey had asked me to fill in for him this morning, and he had asked me to talk about the section in Luke chapter 9 where Jesus asked the question, "Who do men say that I am?" You remember that? In Luke chapter 9 and verse 18, it says, "It happened that while he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, that he questioned them, saying, 'Who do people say that I am?' They answered and said, 'John the Baptist, others say Elijah, but others, the one of the prophets that of old has risen.'" They say that one of the prophets of old has risen. And then Jesus said in verse 20, "But who do you say that I am?" And the answer is from Peter, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." You remember that. Luke records kind of a brief look at that, and so does Mark. They give you just a brief look at that. But where do we have in the New Testament more detail about that situation? Where do you have more detail in the New Testament about who do people say that I am and all of that? You remember where that is? Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16. So let's turn over there to Matthew 16, because since we have more detail there, we can spend a little more time talking about that. In Matthew chapter 16, you have kind of the same question and answer going on, but then Jesus gives a lot more information. Now, it says in verse 13, Jesus asked, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" They said, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, but still others, they say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So the question is a really good question because it has a lot of answers, and it gives Jesus an opportunity to kind of solidify and clarify. He knows what people are saying about him. That's the tricky thing. You and I may not always know what's being said about us out there in the world. We may not even want to know what's being said about us out there in the world, but Jesus knows what's being said. And so he asked the question in order to really clarify the answer. Who do people say that I am? They rightly say, well, folks aren't sure who you are. You've gotten their attention, but they're not really sure. Some think you're John the Baptist. Well, there's some issues with that. They've heard stories, but they haven't seen. So they're not sure. He might be John the Baptist because we've heard a lot about him. Maybe Elijah. Now, what would be the difficulty with it being Elijah? Who was Elijah? What happened to Elijah? He was taken up in a whirlwind, rode a chariot to heaven. So on the one hand, he's not here anymore. On the other hand, he never really died, so maybe it's Elijah. Okay, there's some plausibility there, at least in that. And then others say maybe Jeremiah, one of the prophets. The end result is people are interested in who you are, but people just don't know. You and I look at that and we kind of wonder, how do you not know? How could it be Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, and you not know? And then I realize I probably wouldn't have known either. I probably would not have paid enough attention to the detail of everything to really know who it was. But when he asked, "Who do you say that I am?" then Peter speaks up, and Peter says, "I know who you are." Peter, having had the advantage with the other disciples there of being close to Jesus and really hearing what he did and seeing him interact with people, not just the miraculous, but seeing the compassion, seeing the selflessness, that sort of thing is something that's noticed by people, right? You could probably right now in this moment call to mind somebody who you consider to be completely selfless. You've done that? Those people stand out, don't they? Peter knew who he was. And so Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Peter didn't say, "I'm not sure." You're impressive. He didn't say, "I've seen those miracles and that really makes me wonder." He said, "No, you are the Messiah of God." And that's a huge pronouncement. Jesus then, in response to that, says, "You are blessed because you have figured that out." And then how does he say Peter figured that out? That's an interesting comment that he makes. How does he say Peter knew it? What's he say? I'm sorry? Yeah, the Spirit. My Father who's in heaven told you that. Does he mean in a very literal way, at the point of the question, the Spirit leaned down and whispered into Peter's ear? Is that what he means? Probably not. So then how could he have gotten that information? The flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. How is it then that my Father who is in heaven revealed it to Peter? How did he know? And what that means is Peter understood who Jesus was just like I could have understood who Jesus was had I been there. Just like you can understand who Jesus is today. The way Peter understood Jesus is Peter observed and listened. Peter paid attention. And the evidence that Jesus was the Christ was so overwhelming to the people who paid attention that it was undeniable. It was a direct conclusion of the evidence. Now, think about that in contrast to what Jesus says in places like Matthew 13, where he says, I'm speaking to them in parables. And the reason I'm doing that is because some are seeing but not really seeing, and some are hearing but not really hearing. That's where he says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. So what Jesus says is there's going to be a whole lot of people who are going to see what I do and hear what I say and not understand who I am. You and I don't want to be in that position. That's why we talk about matters of Bible study. Brother Burgess mentioned in that awesome discussion this morning how if we're going to work while it is day, we're going to have to do some study so we know what we're doing. Tremendously valid and helpful point for us, because it's possible for us to think in terms of ourselves as being a Christian is something that happens to me, but not something that I do on a regular basis, not something that I am in practice, in actual productive terms. We tend sometimes to think of being a Christian from the standpoint of having been saved. It's a force that occurred on my life. It is not something that is my life, that my life is consumed with. When you're walking with Jesus on a daily basis like Peter and the apostles were, I would imagine that's a pretty consuming position. Everything in their lives revolved around Jesus being the Messiah of God and taking His truth to humanity. Everything was about that. And so Peter makes the confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. What else could you be, and how else could we respond to the question? The evidence is so overwhelming to those who examined the evidence. Jesus says, that's good. You looked at what happened. You saw that because the Father has allowed you to see that. That's good. And then he says in verse 18, he says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I don't want to spend our time this morning on the discussion about you are Peter and upon this rock, except to say that the word Peter means little bitty rock, and the word rock that Jesus uses means really, really big rock, and so it's not the same thing. He's not saying that you're Peter and upon you I'll build my church. He's saying you're Peter, and upon the confession that you made that I'm the Christ, the Son of the living God, I'm going to build my church. So look at it like this. The church is founded upon Jesus. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 makes that really clear. He's the foundation of it all. So we all know that. We understand that. The church is not founded on a person. It's not founded on you. It's not founded on me. It's not founded on the Apostle Peter, although he did really good work. It's not that. The church is founded upon who Jesus is. But what I want us to focus on out of that statement is the concept that Jesus introduces here of, I will build my church. When you think back to some of the stories Jesus told and some of the parables Jesus told, what is the beginning statement that he uses an awful lot? When he's going to tell a story, tell a parable, offer an illustration, what will he begin with many, many times? The kingdom of heaven is like. Yeah, he will say the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he'll tell a story. Man went on a journey or something like that. So he's trying to build within people's minds this concept of the kingdom. It's a kingdom concept. And so here when he says, I will build my church, the idea that he's after is this is going to be a process. We're going to construct something. Does anybody in here know of the comedian Stephen Wright? Anybody remember Stephen Wright? John does. Anybody else? Two of us? Three of us. Oh, yeah. Ooh. Stephen Wright. On the one hand, one of the worst comedians you'll ever hear in your life. On the other hand, he is hilarious. He made his debut years and years and years ago on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson told him at that time when he was on the show, he said, you're one of the strangest people we've ever had. And he is. He's very dry, and he'll stand and just mutter things. For example, something like this. Say you're in a vehicle and you're traveling at the speed of light and you switch on your lights. Do they do anything? And people go, that's a dumb thing to ask. It's not really funny, it's just a little bit ridiculous. Well, he has one where he talks about construction, the construction industry. And he says, why do we call buildings that are completed buildings? We should call them builts. That's what they ought to be called. When you look at something, you should say, that's a pretty built, because the building process is finished. It's already built, so why call it a building? I think of that, which is kind of frightening, I think of that when Jesus says, I will build my church. Because he is not saying, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to construct this thing and it's going to be completed and then I'm going to go to heaven and it'll be it. It'll just stand there. It'll just be there. That's not what he's saying. The idea of build my church is a concept of once the process begins, once I build it, once I start it, it's never finished. It never becomes a build. It's always going to be building. And Jesus makes that statement to talk about, first, his intention. He wasn't here to be a good person. He wasn't here to heal people. He wasn't here to amaze by the miracles. He was here to build his church. Now, understanding his church gives you more information about that. Those who are a part of the church Jesus built have one huge benefit among many others. One huge benefit. What is that? If you're a part of the church Jesus built, what is the one big benefit in eternity? Salvation. It's salvation. So there is that huge benefit. There are lots and lots of others. So there are benefits to being a part of that church. But from heaven's point of view, Jesus came to establish and build his church. New Testament passages talk about he is the head of the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. The idea, the concept is the church is what it's about. The church is not this sideshow that Jesus also did while he was on earth. The church is the point. Sometimes we get that mixed up because we get to thinking again in terms of, quote, being saved. And we think to ourselves, well, the blood of Jesus saves us. The cross, of course, is the point at which all of that occurs. And so it is salvation that is the grand goal of the work of Jesus. That is true in a sense, but the establishment of the church is really a better way for us to look at it, because the church is comprised of or made up of what or whom? The church is the saved. Yeah. So look at it like this. The Son of God, the Messiah of God, Peter confesses that he's that. The Son of God says, I'm going to build my church. And now, he is reliant upon us for his church to be built. That is an odd thing in the world of construction. In the world of construction, if you decide to build a house, then you control the building of the house, right? You hire the people to come in and frame it. You do the work. You control it, and you decide how it's going to be done, and you decide that it is done. Well, Jesus is a little bit different in building his church. He does decide how it's going to be built. He does decide the way it's going to be built, but then he relies on us for the actual building process. But when he says, I will build my church, in Matthew chapter 18, he doesn't say maybe. He says, I will build my church. This is going to happen. Because he knows there's always going to be those who, like Peter, will recognize who he is and will follow him anywhere and do whatever needs to be done. He knows there's going to be people like that. In the Old Testament, that was described as the remnant, the small group that will always stay with him. In the New Testament, those folks, you know what they're called? The remnant. What are they called in the New Testament? Christians. That's what they're called. He knows there's always going to be those who will do it. And so he says, I'll build it. I'll build my church. When you think about Matthew 16, 18, and Jesus saying, I'll build my church, I want you to think of some other passages as well. We're not going to have time to look at them in detail, but I want you to think about Daniel chapter 2. Always think about Daniel chapter 2 when Jesus says, I will build my church. We'll turn over there and look. Verse 44 in Daniel 2 is kind of the crux of it all. But in Daniel chapter 2, you remember you have Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. And there's this great big statue. And let's go back over here. In chapter 2, it begins with the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. He sees the statue. The end result of all that, because we need to kind of rush through it, verse 32 of Daniel chapter 2, the head of that statue was made of gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. That's what he saw. Verse 34, you continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried it away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. All right. So Daniel begins to tell the king about his dream. And he says, okay, this is what you saw, and now he's going to tell him this is what it means. And you remember, it's where he says, okay, this is what the things represent. You're the king right now, and so you are the head of gold. And then there'll come another kingdom, the Medo-Persians and the Greeks. And ultimately we get down to Rome, right? And that's where Daniel says, in the days of the Roman kings, the God of heaven will establish a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Look at verse 44. In the days of those kings, the Roman kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It's not going to belong to somebody else like every other kingdom does. Every other kingdom kind of goes to the next group or whatever. It's not going to happen with this kingdom. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. So in the days of the Roman kings, God's going to establish a kingdom that's going to be eternal. That is exactly what Jesus is saying in Matthew 16, 18 when he says, I will build my church. That church that Jesus is going to build is the kingdom that Daniel is talking about here with this statue and all of that. It's an eternal kingdom. Verse 45, inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron and the bronze and the clay and the silver and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and its interpretation is true. The idea there is Jesus is that stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands. Jesus is the one who starts that process. Daniel talked about it, and Daniel was around on the earth about when? Somebody give me some dates, some rough BC dates. About when? Well, he is in Babylon because of the fall of Jerusalem, right? The Babylonians went to Jerusalem. They besieged Jerusalem in about 605 BC, roughly. Fully took Jerusalem in what, 586 BC? That time frame, 601 to 586. They took Jerusalem. So Daniel goes back to Babylon probably in the 580s, somewhere in there. So 500 and some odd years before Jesus said, I will build my church, Daniel said, God's going to build His kingdom and it'll last forever. And that kingdom is going to start with a stone, not made with hands. A stone that is not made with hands. A stone that is, well, not from this world. That's Jesus. Now go to one more passage for me real quick, Isaiah 28. Isaiah 28. Isaiah is prophesying a little bit before Daniel. Isaiah is in the 700s, more than likely, a couple hundred years before Daniel. Isaiah 28. Now, Isaiah 28 is the first part of it is a pretty It's a pretty sad chapter. It's a pretty rough chapter. God, through Isaiah, is saying, okay, these people haven't been listening and they're going to have to pay for it. These people have not been doing what I told them to do. They have ignored me and it's going to cost them. And he doesn't say it from a ha-ha-ha standpoint. He says it from, this is terrible. It's just going to be terrible. But, beginning in verse 14 of Isaiah 28, verse 14 of Isaiah 28, he says, therefore, hear the words of the Lord, O scoffers, who rule this people who are in Jerusalem. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have made a pact, the overwhelming scourge will not reach us when it passes by, for we have made falsehood our refuge, and we have concealed ourselves with deception. So he's leading up, and here's what he's saying. He's saying the leaders of my people today in the 700s BC, in Isaiah's time, the leaders of my people have said, nothing can touch us. We have made arrangements with all the people around us. We have made covenants. We have made treaties. We have protected ourselves. We don't need God. We've got it under control. Leave God out of it. We're fine. That's what they've said. Know of any other kingdoms that have done that? That's where the people are. Here's his response to that. Therefore, verse 16, Isaiah 28:16. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a costly cornerstone for the foundation firmly placed. He who believes in it will not be disturbed. And then he goes on and he says, I'm going to change things. He says, I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the level. Then hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will overflow the secret place. Your covenant with death will be canceled, and your pact with Sheol will not stand. God says there's going to come a time when I'm going to lay a stone and build a kingdom. And when I do that, all of your arrangements, all of your treaties, all of your agreements, those are all gone. Those don't stand. Those don't matter. What matters is the kingdom I'm going to build that starts with the stone. And that's Jesus. So what I want you to see is, when Jesus says in Matthew 16:18, somewhere in the neighborhood of AD 31, 32, probably 32, but somewhere in that time frame, for hundreds of years, God's intention has been for Jesus to build His church. For hundreds of years. In fact, I would suggest to you that according to Ephesians 1, you can go back a little further than hundreds of years. You can go back to eternity. Before the foundation of the world, God intended for Jesus to build His church. Before the foundation of the world, God intended for a stone not made with hands to start a revolution in this world and construct a church, a building made up of people, the saved. One more reference. We've looked at Daniel 2, we've looked at Isaiah 28. Now go with me over to 1 Peter chapter 1 and we'll wrap it up. 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, please. Peter knows about this by inspiration. And so Peter says in verse 4 of 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4 of 1 Peter chapter 1, as he's talking to us about being what we ought to be, being Christians and living as we ought to live, he says, and coming to Him as to a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God, you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Then he quotes Isaiah 26:18. But think about what he says. And coming to Him, that's Jesus, as to a living stone. He is that living stone, back over in Daniel 2, made without hands, that crushed everything and started everything anew. Jesus is that. And coming to Jesus as to a living stone, you also are a living stone. You're being built up into a spiritual house to offer up spiritual sacrifices. See, Christianity isn't something that happens to you. Christianity is something that you get involved in and you become a builder. You become a part of the construction process. You become a part of this building that Jesus is constructing, His church, His body, of which He is the head. You and I are living stones in this great big structure that Jesus is trying to build. And He needs our help to build it. He needs us to play our part, but it's going to be built. that the second bell? Okay, we'll wrap up. He gives you a quotation out of Isaiah 28. He gives you a quotation out of Psalm 118. But notice one thing before we stop. He says in verse 5 that we are being built up in order to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. Then he says essentially the same thing in another way in verse 9, where he says we're supposed to proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called us out of darkness into His marvelous light. It fits really well with what Brother Burgess talked about. We've got to be working. We've got to be building this thing. We have to be doing it. Now, God's way, but we must be involved in this process. And we need to be thankful for it because it is eternal. And that means you're involved in something that is eternal. We'll take a short break and then we'll begin our worship.